He survived war, training, and missions that most people will never hear about. But none of that prepared him for the silence that came after. Deep in the wilderness, a former Navy SEAL believed discipline and strength would be enough to keep him alive through winter. But the land did not respond to strength, and the storm did not care who he used to be. Again and again, it was his dog who stopped him, redirected him, and warned him, without a single word. What began as instinct slowly revealed itself as something more. Protection that arrived before danger, guidance before loss. This is not a story about fighting the world, but about learning when to listen and who was sent to walk ahead of you. If this story moves you, please like this video, subscribe to Silent Paws Steady Hearts, and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Caleb Monroe woke before dawn, the way he always did, long before the mountains outside his cabin began to glow with the pale suggestion of morning. Sleep never released him gently. It loosened its grip in fragments, letting him surface slowly, alert before he was fully awake, breath already measured, muscles tight as if bracing for impact. The ceiling above him was unfinished pine, rough-hewn and practical, nothing decorative, nothing that invited lingering thoughts. He lay still for several seconds, listening. Wind through the trees, the distant creak of timber contracting in the cold. No footsteps, no voices, no sudden sounds that required action. Only then did he sit up. At 40, Caleb carried his body the way men do when they have learned, through repetition and consequence, that posture is not about appearance, but readiness. He was tall, just over 6 feet. But it was the width of his shoulders that drew attention, the sense of mass held under control. His frame was large-boned, functional rather than sculpted, built for endurance, leverage, and long periods of strain. Years of harsh weather had left his skin darkened and textured, the faint roughness of someone more familiar with wind and sun than mirrors. His hair was cut short in a tactical military style, the sides shaved close, the top kept just long enough to lift slightly on its own. Early silver threaded the brown at his temples, not from age alone, but from stress that had accumulated faster than time. A short stubble traced his jaw, evenly trimmed, disciplined, giving his angular face a hard, deliberate clarity. He reached for the edge of the bed and paused, as he always did, eyes flicking toward the doorway. The habit was automatic. He had learned long ago that the moment you stopped checking was the moment you were already too late. Only after confirming what he already knew, that he was alone, did he stand. The cabin sat on the outskirts of a small mountain town in the northern United States, the kind of place people ended up when they wanted to be forgotten or hoped forgetting would find them. Winters arrived early here and stayed late. The cold had a way of stripping conversations down to necessity. People asked what you needed, not where you came from. Caleb appreciated that. He had never been good at explaining his past in ways civilians understood, and he had grown tired of watching their expressions shift when they realized he wasn't exaggerating. He pulled on the same clothing he wore every day. An olive green combat shirt with reinforced seams and camouflage-patterned sleeves, tactical pants faded slightly from use, a wide utility belt, and sturdy boots worn soft at the creases. A military field watch rested on his left wrist, its face scratched but clear. Time kept precisely even when he felt unmoored. The uniform no longer marked him as active duty, but it clung to him like a second skin. Changing it felt dishonest, as though pretending he had become someone else. Before leaving the bedroom, he performed his ritual. He checked the window latch, the back door, the front. Not because he expected trouble, but because his body demanded proof of safety before allowing the day to begin. When he finished, he exhaled slowly, as if releasing a breath he had been holding since nightfall. Ash was already awake. The German Shepherd lay near the front door, long body stretched along the floorboards, head lifted, ears alert. At 6 or 7 years old, Ash was past the reckless energy of youth, but far from frail. He was large even for his breed, his frame powerful and balanced, chest deep, back straight, muscles defined beneath a dense coat of black and warm tan. The dark saddle of his back blended seamlessly into the shadowed room, while the lighter fur along his legs and muzzle caught the dim light filtering through the window. His eyes, dark amber, steady, observant, tracked Caleb without urgency, the way only a working dog truly at rest could. Ash had once been military K9, trained to detect danger before it announced itself. Explosives, structural instability, subtle changes in air pressure that humans dismissed as imagination. War had shaped him too, though in quieter ways. His movements were controlled, economical, his reactions precise. He wore no vest now, only a simple, dark collar, unadorned, functional. When Caleb met his gaze, Ash's tail gave a single restrained sweep against the floor. "You're up early," Caleb said, his voice low, unused from disuse rather than strain. Ash blinked slowly, then stood, stretching with deliberate care, as if aware of the stiffness that came with age. He crossed the room and paused near the window, nose lifting, ears angling towards something beyond the glass. Caleb followed his line of sight out of habit. The forest stood still, pines layered in shadow, no movement, nothing that explained the dog's attention. Ash did not bark. He did not growl. He simply stared, muscles subtly engaged, listening to something Caleb could not hear. Caleb frowned, a faint crease forming between his brows. He trusted Ash more than he trusted most people. That trust had been earned under circumstances where mistakes were fatal. Still, he saw nothing. After a moment, Ash relaxed, stepping back, as if whatever had caught his attention had passed. Caleb told himself it was nothing. He had learned that not every instinct needed to be acted on. But a thin unease settled anyway, familiar and unwelcome. After coffee, black, strong, practical, Caleb drove into town. The road was narrow and winding, flanked by trees that crowded close, their branches heavy with frost. The truck moved easily, tires humming against cold asphalt. He liked driving early, before the town fully woke. It gave him the illusion of moving through a place without being seen. The hardware store was already open. Sarah Bennett stood behind the counter, sorting receipts with methodical care. She was in her late 30s, slender, her posture slightly stooped from years of leaning over ledgers and shelves. Her hair, a muted auburn streaked with gray she hadn't bothered to dye, was pulled into a loose knot at the base of her neck. Her skin was pale, freckled lightly across the bridge of her nose, weathered more by stress than sun. She looked up when the bell chimed, offering a polite smile that stopped short of curiosity. "Morning, Caleb," she said. "Cold one." "Morning," he replied. Sarah didn't ask questions. She never did. That, more than anything, had earned his quiet respect. She rang up his supplies: fuel stabilizer, heavy-duty fasteners, weather stripping, with practiced efficiency. When she slid the receipt across the counter, her hand paused briefly. "You heading out past the ridge today?" she asked, tone neutral. "Maybe," Caleb said. She nodded once. "Wind's been strange since last night." He looked at her then, properly. "Strange how?" She shrugged. "Hard to explain. Just restless." Caleb thought of Ash at the window, of the way the dog had listened to nothing. "Thanks," he said. She gave a small smile, the kind people used when they sensed something was being carried, but knew better than to touch it. Outside, Ash waited patiently in the truck, head resting near the window. When Caleb opened the door, the dog shifted aside to make room without being asked. As they drove back toward the cabin, the sky remained pale and unreadable, the mountains silent witnesses to habits that refused to fade. Halfway home, Ash lifted his head abruptly, his ears angled forward, body leaning subtly toward the windshield. He let out a low, almost inaudible sound. Not a warning, not fear, but recognition. Caleb slowed the truck instinctively. "What is it?" he murmured. Ash stared ahead, unblinking, as if tracking something just beyond perception. The road was empty, the forest unchanged, yet the dog's focus did not waver. Then, just as suddenly, Ash relaxed, settling back into his seat. Caleb's pulse took longer to slow. He drove the rest of the way in silence, the sensation lingering like an unfinished thought. Whatever Ash had sensed, Caleb had not. That, more than any memory, unsettled him. Back at the cabin, as evening fell and the light drained from the sky, Caleb completed his routines again. Doors, windows, perimeter. Ash followed him, unprompted, positioning himself at the front of the house once night settled fully. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it a sound that might have been nothing more than branches rubbing together, or something else entirely. Caleb lay down facing the door, boots placed within reach, breath slow but shallow. Ash remained awake longer than usual, eyes open, ears angled toward the dark. The man without a battlefield slept lightly, unaware that the silence he had chosen was already listening back. The letter arrived 3 days after the wind shifted. Caleb found it wedged between grocery flyers and a utility notice, the envelope heavier than it needed to be, its paper thick and yellowed at the edges, as if it had traveled farther than the distance from the post office to his cabin. His name was typed, precise and impersonal, the return address stamped from a legal firm in a county he had never visited. He stood by the door for a moment before opening it, the way he used to pause before breaching an unfamiliar room, letting instinct surface before action. Ash watched from the corner of the room, head lowered slightly, ears angled forward. The dog's body was still, but not relaxed. That alone was enough to make Caleb slow down. Inside the envelope was a formal notice of death and a folded document bearing a seal pressed deep into the paper. The name Elias Monroe sat at the top, stark and undeniable. Caleb felt the faint, distant recognition of it, an echo rather than a memory. Elias had been his father's older brother, a man spoken of rarely and always in vague terms. He lived up north. He kept to himself. He didn't like visitors. That was the extent of what Caleb knew. The notice stated the facts plainly. Elias Monroe, deceased. No surviving spouse. No children. One living next of kin. Caleb Monroe. He read the page twice before the meaning settled. He had not spoken to Elias in over 20 years. There had been no falling out, no dramatic rift, just distance that grew until it hardened into absence. Caleb folded the letter carefully, as if rough handling might change what it said, and set it on the table. Ash rose and crossed the room, stopping beside the chair. His nose lifted, testing the air, then dropped to the table's edge, hovering near the paper. His lips pulled back just enough to show teeth, not in threat, but in unease. A low sound vibrated in his chest, quiet, controlled, unmistakable. "Easy," Caleb said, though his own pulse had quickened. Ash did not move away. He stared at the letter as if it carried a scent that did not belong. Caleb opened the second document. This one was shorter, less formal. It listed an address, coordinates really, near the boundary of a national forest several hours north. Along with it was a single line, handwritten in a steady, old-fashioned script that pressed hard into the page. "If you're alive to read this, then the place still matters." Caleb felt the words settle somewhere behind his ribs. Not painful, but heavy. Elias had not been a sentimental man, from what little he knew. There was no apology here, no explanation, only assumption. The assumption that Caleb would understand what it meant to survive long enough to be chosen. He stood and retrieved a folded road map from a drawer he hadn't opened in years. The paper crackled as he spread it across the table, tracing highways north, then smaller roads, then lines that thinned into nothing. He marked the coordinates with a pen. Ash stiffened. The dog let out a sharp, sudden growl and stepped between Caleb and the table, head lowered, body angled protectively, eyes fixed not on Caleb, but on the direction the map indicated. North. Always north. The sound was brief but intense, the kind Ash reserved for moments that demanded attention. Caleb froze. In combat, hesitation could get you killed. In survival, it could save your life. He chose the latter. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Ash did not look at him. His gaze stayed locked on the map, his ears rigid, tail still. The growl faded into a tense silence, but the warning remained, written into the lines of his body. Caleb folded the map slowly and set it aside. "All right," he said. "We'll take it easy." Ash did not relax. That night, Caleb slept poorly. Dreams came in fragments. Cold air, the weight of gear on his shoulders, a voice calling his name from somewhere he couldn't see. He woke before dawn with the familiar ache behind his eyes, the residue of memories that refused to stay buried. Ash stood at the foot of the bed, awake, watching the door. In the morning, Caleb drove into town again, the letter tucked into his jacket pocket like a concealed blade. He stopped at the county clerk's office, a squat brick building that smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. The woman behind the counter introduced herself as Margaret Ellis, her posture straight despite her age, silver hair pulled back neatly, wire-rimmed glasses perched low on her nose. Her movements were precise, practiced, shaped by decades of process. "Elias Monroe," she repeated, fingers already moving across the keyboard. "Haven't heard that name in a while." "You knew him?" Caleb asked. She nodded. "Not personally. He came in once every few years. Always alone. Always prepared. Paid his taxes early. Never argued." That fit. Elias sounded like a man who trusted systems only when he controlled his part of them. Margaret slid a folder across the counter. "Property's been in his name for decades. Never sold, never leased. Cabin, outbuildings, well-registered, generator permit renewed regularly." "Renewed?" Caleb asked. "Recently?" "Last one was filed 2 years ago," she said, "through a proxy." Caleb absorbed that quietly. Elias had planned beyond his own presence. That, more than the inheritance itself, unsettled him. Outside, Ash paced near the truck, nose to the wind. When Caleb approached, the dog circled once, then stopped, staring north again. Caleb followed his gaze toward the mountains rising faintly in the distance, their peaks lost in cloud. On the drive home, Caleb called his father for the first time in months. The line crackled before a familiar voice answered, older now, slower. "Elias?" his father said when Caleb explained. There was a pause. "I wondered when that would happen." "You never told me much about him," Caleb said. His father sighed. He didn't want to be known. After the work he didn't trust easy answers. He thought distance was safer. "For who?" Caleb asked. "For everyone." The call ended without resolution. Some men carried their reasons to the grave. Others built them into places that waited. Back at the cabin, Caleb laid the documents out on the table again. He studied the coordinates, the sparse notes, the absence of detail. Elias had not left him wealth. He had left him a question. Ash sat beside him, close enough that Caleb could feel the dog's warmth against his leg. The shepherd leaned forward, nose brushing the edge of the paper, then lifted his head and met Caleb's eyes. There was no fear there, only insistence. The rehook arrived not as noise, but as certainty. Ash turned away from the table and walked to the front door, stopping there and looking back once. The message was clear, unarguable. Caleb's chest tightened. He had spent years running from roots, from names, from anything that threatened to pull him backward into a life he hadn't chosen. Yet here it was, waiting, not asking, expecting. He packed that evening with the efficiency of someone accustomed to leaving quickly. Supplies, tools, fuel. He left behind anything ornamental, anything that tied him to the illusion of permanence. When he locked the cabin for the last time, he felt no regret, only focus. Ash jumped into the truck without hesitation, settling into place like a soldier answering a call. As they pulled onto the highway, the mountains ahead darkened under gathering cloud. Caleb kept his eyes forward, hands steady on the wheel. He did not know why Elias had chosen him. He did not know what waited at the end of the road. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever had been left unsaid was no longer content to remain buried. The road disappeared long before the signal did. Caleb noticed it first in the way the asphalt thinned, then fractured, then surrendered entirely to gravel and packed earth. The truck moved slower now, tires crunching over stone, the steering wheel transmitting every uneven truth of the ground into his hands. Pines pressed closer on both sides, their trunks dark and straight, their branches knitting together overhead until the sky became a narrow, distant strip of gray. Autumn had already lost its warmth here. The air carried the sharpness of early winter, clean but unforgiving, the kind that stripped scent and sound down to essentials. Ash sat upright in the passenger seat, body tense but controlled. His head shifted in small increments as they advanced, ears rotating independently, cataloging the forest. At 6 or 7 years old, Ash no longer wasted energy on excitement. Every movement was deliberate. His thick black and tan coat caught the light in brief flashes where the trees broke apart, the dark saddle of his back blending almost seamlessly with shadow. When the truck slowed, Ash leaned forward slightly, nostrils flaring, reading the terrain in ways Caleb knew he never could. They reached the clearing without ceremony. No gate, no marker, just a widening of trees and the sudden presence of structure where none should have been. The house stood solid and restrained, set back from the tree line as if it had learned long ago not to challenge the forest directly. It was built of thick timber, weathered but intact, the lines practical rather than aesthetic. The roof pitched steeply enough to shed snow, the windows small and reinforced, their glass dull but unbroken. It did not look abandoned. It looked paused. Caleb shut off the engine and sat still for a moment, letting the quiet settle. There was no distant traffic here, no human sound at all, only wind threading through branches and the faint, constant murmur of water somewhere nearby. A creak, if Elias's notes were accurate. Ash was already moving, jumping down from the truck and stopping short, body squared, eyes locked on the space between the house and the surrounding structures. Only then did Caleb notice them. To the left stood a low building, likely a storage shed, its door reinforced, hinges heavy with age, but oiled recently enough to move. Farther back, partially obscured by trees, rose a squat concrete structure housing the generator. Beyond that, a smaller enclosure sat near the sound of running water, pipes leading underground toward the house. They were arranged with intention, distance measured, angles calculated, and between them, nothing. No covered walkways, no protection from the open ground. Just space, exposed and vulnerable, waiting to be crossed. Ash let out a short, sharp huff and moved closer to Caleb's leg, positioning himself subtly in front of him. His ears flattened, then rose again, scanning. The fur along his shoulders lifted, not fully bristled, but alert enough to signal concern. Caleb followed his gaze. The wind shifted, sudden and forceful, cutting across the clearing and slipping between the ink the buildings with a sound like breath drawn through clenched teeth. It wasn't loud, but it had weight, direction, purpose. This place wasn't finished, Caleb murmured. Ash did not disagree. They entered the house first. The door opened with resistance, wood swollen from years of temperature change, but the hinges held firm. Inside, the air was cold and dry, carrying the scent of old timber, metal, and something faintly acidic, oil perhaps, or preserved fuel. The interior was sparse but deliberate. A central wood stove anchored the main room, its iron surface cold to the touch but well-maintained. Shelving lined the walls, sturdy and practical, scarred by use rather than neglect. A heavy table sat near the window, its surface marked with old measurements and shallow cuts, the kind left by someone who worked while thinking. Ash circled once, then lay down near the stove, head resting on his paws, eyes never fully closing. Caleb moved through the space slowly, hands brushing surfaces, confirming solidity. He felt the absence of comfort keenly. This was not a place built to welcome. It was built to endure. The first real test came when he stepped back outside. The wind had strengthened, carrying with it the scent of moisture and cold stone. Caleb zipped his jacket higher and turned toward the generator building, calculating distance and exposure. It wasn't far. 30 yards? Maybe less. In any town, it would have been nothing. Ash moved instantly, stepping in front of him, blocking the path. His stance was rigid now, head low, eyes intense. He let out a low growl, not loud, not aggressive, but unmistakable. Caleb stopped short. "What?" he asked, more sharply than he intended. Ash did not move. The dog's gaze flicked to the ground, then to the generator, then back to Caleb. His tail was still, his body angled slightly sideways, a herding posture repurposed into warning. The wind surged again, stronger this time, whipping loose leaves into the air. The ground beneath Caleb's boots shifted subtly, slick with a thin layer of frost he hadn't noticed. Caleb exhaled through his nose. He had crossed minefields. He had advanced under fire. And yet, standing here, uncertain whether to take a few steps across open ground, he felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with unfamiliar doubt. "Fine," he said quietly. Later, Ash relaxed only marginally, stepping aside but keeping himself between Caleb and the open space. The day passed in assessment rather than action. Caleb inventoried supplies, tested locks, checked fuel levels. Elias had prepared carefully, but not generously. There was enough to function, not enough to waste. As the light faded, the temperature dropped sharply and the wind grew more insistent, funneling through the clearing in unpredictable currents. The rehook came as dusk settled. Caleb stood at the window, watching the generator building sway slightly under a gust, its shadow stretching across the ground. Ash rose suddenly, hackles lifting fully now, ears snapping forward. He let out a single bark, short, sharp, and urgent. Caleb turned just in time to see a section of ground between the buildings collapse inward with a dull, wet sound, revealing a shallow sink masked by leaves and frost. Had he crossed minutes earlier, he would have stepped directly into it. Ash stared at the exposed earth, then back at Caleb, eyes steady, unblinking. Caleb felt the chill reach somewhere deeper than skin. "You knew," he said. Ash's tail gave one controlled sweep. Not pride, not reassurance, simply confirmation. Night came hard. The wind battered the house in waves, testing seams, probing weaknesses. Caleb lit the stove and fed it carefully, rationing fuel instinctively. He ate, standing up, back to the wall, listening to the structure respond to pressure the way living things did. Creaking, shifting, but holding. Ash remained near the door, occasionally lifting his head when the wind changed pitch. Each time, Caleb noted it, filing away the pattern. He realized, with a mix of unease and clarity, that he was not the most perceptive being in the room. When he finally lay down to rest, boots still within reach, he stared up at the ceiling and replayed the day in his mind. Elias had built this place with knowledge, with foresight, but he had also left it incomplete, as if waiting for someone else to finish the thought. Outside, the wind howled through the clearing, unchallenged. Inside, a man and a dog listened, each aware in their own way that survival here would demand more than strength. It would demand trust. The first snow arrived sideways. It did not fall gently the way it did in towns, soft and ornamental, collecting on rooftops like a promise. Here, it came driven by wind, thin needles of ice stinging any exposed skin. Turning the air itself into resistance, Caleb felt it the moment he opened the door that morning. The cold slicing through layers of fabric and muscle, reaching places memory still lived. Ash stepped out first, paws sinking slightly into the crusted ground. His body lowered instinctively, shoulders rolling forward, spine aligning into a posture that belonged to work rather than rest. At 6 or 7 years old, his movements were no longer quick, but they were exact. He paused, head angled, ears catching the pitch of the wind as it slid between the buildings. His tail held steady, neither raised nor tucked, a sign of calculation rather than fear. Caleb followed, boots crunching against frozen soil. He had slept lightly, waking often to the sound of wind striking the house from different directions, testing it the way water tested stone. The generator needed checking. The fuel line had stuttered the night before, just enough to demand attention. It was a short walk, less than half a minute under normal conditions, but nothing here behaved normally. Ash moved ahead 2 steps, then stopped abruptly. Caleb nearly collided with him. He frowned, irritation flaring before reason caught up. "What is it now?" he muttered. Ash did not look back, his gaze fixed on the open ground between the house and the generator building. Ears pulled slightly flat as the wind surged again, stronger this time, dragging loose snow across the clearing. The sound changed pitch, deepening into something that vibrated rather than howled. Caleb took a step anyway. The ground betrayed him instantly. His boot slid on an invisible sheet of ice, his balance shifting too far, too fast. For a split second, the familiar surge of combat reflex kicked in, muscles bracing, mind narrowing. But there was nothing to fight here, only gravity and momentum. Ash moved before Caleb hit the ground. The shepherd lunged sideways, jaws closing around the back of Caleb's jacket, teeth gripping fabric without piercing skin. With a sharp pull and his full weight braced backward, Ash dragged him off his collapsing trajectory. Caleb hit the ground hard, but not where he would have fallen. A second later, a dead pine limb, heavy with ice, crashed down exactly where his head had been headed, splintering against the frozen earth with a crack that echoed through the trees. Caleb lay there, breath punched out of him, staring at the gray sky. Ash released his grip immediately and stepped back, standing over him, chest heaving slightly, eyes locked on Caleb's face. There was no panic in them, only urgency, followed by watchfulness. Caleb pushed himself up slowly, joints protesting. He turned his head and looked at the fallen limb, then at the slick, glassy surface beneath his boots. The wind swept across the clearing again, spinning snow into a low, fast-moving spiral that hugged the ground. "Damn it," he breathed. Ash whined once, low in his throat, then turned deliberately and walked a longer, curved route toward the generator building, pausing to look back. The path he chose skirted closer to the tree line, where the wind was broken and the ground uneven enough to hold traction. Caleb followed without argument. Inside the generator shed, the air was marginally warmer, thick with the smell of fuel and oil. The machine itself was solid, old but maintained, humming unevenly as if aware of its own vulnerability. Caleb adjusted the line, tightened fittings with hands that still shook faintly from adrenaline. As he worked, his eyes kept drifting back to Ash, who stood near the open doorway, head tilted, ears tracking the wind beyond the walls. "You knew?" Caleb said quietly, not accusing, not praising, just stating fact. Ash flicked an ear, as if acknowledging the sound of his name rather than the meaning behind it. Later, when Caleb returned to the house, he pulled one of Elias's notebooks from the shelf. He had skimmed them before, looking for inventory lists and structural notes, but now he read slowly, deliberately, the way one read a map through dangerous terrain. Elias's handwriting was tight, precise, with margins filled by additional calculations. Wind vectors, snow load patterns, notes about ice forming faster in certain corridors due to airflow compression between buildings. One passage caught his attention. Avoid direct crossing during early winter storms. Ice accumulates unevenly. Wind shear strongest from the northwest. Dangerous vortex near generator approach. Caleb looked up. The direction matched exactly where Ash had blocked him. A chill settled over him that had nothing to do with temperature. The rehook came quietly, without spectacle. Caleb traced the note with his finger, then stood and walked back to the window. Outside, Ash stood in the clearing, snow dusting his back, body angled away from the northwest wind. He was positioned precisely where the pressure seemed to break, where snow drifted but did not spin. It was not chance. Caleb realized then that Ash wasn't reacting in the moment. He was remembering. The dog had learned this landscape already, through scent, sound, vibration, cataloging danger the way Caleb once cataloged threats on a battlefield. And Elias, years before, had seen the same patterns with tools and math, translating instinct into structure. Different languages, same truth. The afternoon deepened into evening. The storm did not intensify, but it did not retreat either. It lingered, persistent, testing patience more than endurance. Caleb moved through the house making small adjustments, sealing a draft here, shifting supplies there, altering his routines without consciously naming the reason. He no longer took the shortest path between tasks. Ash shadowed him closely, occasionally stopping, forcing pauses that Caleb obeyed even when he didn't fully understand why. Each time he listened, something went wrong elsewhere instead. That night, as they sat by the stove, the fire casting uneven light across the room, Caleb reached out and rested his hand briefly against Ash's shoulder. The fur was coarse beneath his palm, warm, alive. "Guess you've been trying to tell me something," he said. Ash leaned into the contact, just slightly, the way working dogs did when acknowledging connection without abandoning vigilance. Caleb stared into the fire and thought of all the times he had overridden instinct in favor of orders, of logic stripped of context. He had survived those choices. Others had not. Outside, the wind shifted again, but this time, it passed without incident. The lesson was settling in. Here, survival would not be about forcing the environment to comply. It would be about learning when to yield and listening to the voice that never spoke. Caleb discovered the drawings on the fourth morning, tucked beneath a false bottom in one of the workbenches inside the shed. He hadn't been looking for them. He had been checking for rot, tapping beams with the handle of a screwdriver, listening for the hollow sound that meant weakness. When the panel shifted under his weight, he froze, instinct flaring before thought. He knelt, pried the wood up carefully, and found a bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth, the edges darkened by age, but protected from damp. The drawings were meticulous, not architectural in the polished sense, but precise in the way field plans were. Clear lines, handwritten measurements, notes crowding the margins. They depicted a covered passage connecting the house, the generator shed, and the storage building, elevated just enough to stay above drifting snow, angled to break prevailing winds rather than resist them outright. The structure wasn't meant to be sealed. It was meant to breathe. Caleb sat back on his heels, the smell of oil and old paper filling the shed, and understood immediately what Elias had been trying to finish. This wasn't an improvement. It was the missing system. Without it, the buildings were organs without arteries, each functioning alone, but vulnerable the moment the body was forced to move. Ash lay just outside the shed door, half in shadow, half in the weak light filtering through the trees. His large frame was relaxed but attentive, chin resting on his paws, ears angled to catch the wind. When Caleb spread the drawings out on the workbench, Ash lifted his head and shifted slightly, repositioning himself closer to the tree line. Caleb noticed. He stepped outside and stood where Ash had moved, feeling the difference immediately. The wind lost its edge there, its force diffused by the slope of the ground and the staggered trunks beyond. Snow collected, but it didn't spin. It didn't cut. "You picked this," Caleb said quietly. Ash's tail moved once, slow and controlled. Caleb spent the rest of the day studying Elias's notes. The handwriting grew tighter in places, less steady, as if written by a hand that tired easily. There were corrections layered over older calculations, arrows redirecting loads, warnings circled more than once. Elias had known what needed to be built. He had simply run out of time. By morning, Caleb had made his decision. He began with the posts. He measured twice, 3 times, marking the ground where the supports would sink deep enough to resist frost heave. The work was slow and punishing, the earth stubborn beneath the surface crust, forcing him to rely on leverage rather than brute strength. His shoulders burned. His hands numbed and thawed and numbed again. Ash remained present without interfering. He lay in the same position each time Caleb placed a marker, always at the edge of the windbreak, always facing the open clearing. When Caleb adjusted a post a few inches, Ash shifted too, correcting him without touch or sound. Caleb learned to watch for it. The labor stripped thought down to rhythm. Dig, measure, adjust, set. Each movement required attention, and in that attention, memories began to surface. Not violently, not all at once, but like fragments released by the steady pressure of effort. Faces without names, the sound of boots on gravel, the weight of responsibility that had once been constant, unrelenting. Here, there were no orders, no objectives handed down from above, only a structure that either held or failed. That difference mattered more than he expected. On the 3rd day, as he was lifting a beam into place, a truck appeared at the edge of the clearing. The engine cut, and a man stepped out slowly, movements economical, assessing before approaching. He was in his late 50s, lean rather than thin, with a posture shaped by decades of physical work. His beard was gray and close-cropped, framing a face lined by sun and wind rather than age alone. He wore heavy work boots, jeans patched at the knees, and a flannel jacket faded almost to softness. Ash rose immediately, standing between Caleb and the newcomer, body alert but not aggressive. The man stopped a respectful distance away. "Easy," he said, voice low. "I'm not here to startle anyone." Caleb set the beam down carefully. "Can I help you?" The man nodded toward the half-set posts. "Name's Miles Turner. Elias and we worked some things together, years back." His eyes moved over the site, sharp and practiced. "Heard someone was finally up here." Miles' gaze lingered on the drawings spread across the workbench. "He didn't get to finish that," he said, not as a question. "No," Caleb replied. Miles stepped closer, crouching to examine the measurements. His fingers traced a line, stopping at a notation Elias had circled twice. "Good design," he muttered. "Not forgiving, though." "I didn't expect it to be," Caleb said. Miles straightened, studying him more closely now. There was curiosity there, but also restraint, as if he had learned not to pry where answers came at a cost. "You know what this takes?" he asked. Caleb met his gaze. "I know what happens if it isn't done." Miles nodded once. "That's usually enough." He glanced at Ash, who had relaxed slightly but not stepped aside. "Dog's got sense." "He's smarter than I am out here," Caleb said. Miles smiled faintly at that. He stayed only an hour, offering adjustments, pointing out stress points Elias had worried over in his later notes. He did not offer to stay. He did not need to. Before leaving, he paused by the truck and looked back once. "Build it the way he planned," he said. "Don't rush it. This place doesn't forgive shortcuts." When the truck disappeared, the clearing felt quieter than before. The rehook came later that afternoon. Caleb was aligning the first crossbeam when Ash suddenly stood and moved several feet downslope, lying down in a spot Caleb had not marked. The dog's body pressed low to the ground, ears back, eyes steady. Caleb hesitated, then followed, standing where Ash had been moments earlier. The wind struck hard enough to stagger him. He stepped back instinctively, heart pounding, and watched as loose snow lifted into a tight spiral exactly where he had intended to place the beam. The vortex lasted only seconds before collapsing, but the message was clear. Caleb adjusted the placement. Ash returned to his original position, satisfied. By the end of the week, the skeletal frame of the passage stood between the buildings, stark against the trees. It wasn't finished. The roof was incomplete. The sides still open, but the line of it was undeniable now, a statement of intention etched into the land. Caleb stood beneath it at dusk, muscles aching, breath visible in the cooling air. He looked at the structure, then at Ash, who sat nearby, posture calm. "You're mapping this place faster than I ever could," Caleb said. Ash's eyes flicked toward the forest, then back. That night, as Caleb lay on the floor near the stove, exhaustion pulling him under more deeply than sleep had since his arrival, he felt something unfamiliar loosen inside his chest. The memories that surfaced did not crush him. They passed, acknowledged and released, each one leaving a fraction of weight behind. Outside, the unfinished passage creaked softly in the wind. Inside, a man who had spent years dismantling himself piece by piece began, quietly, to build something that might hold. The storm did not announce itself. There was no dramatic shift in the sky, no warning carried by birds or distant thunder. Winter arrived the way it always did in places that survived rather than adapted, quietly, decisively, without negotiation. Caleb sensed it first in the pressure change, the way the air thickened as dusk fell, heavy and unsettled. By nightfall, the wind had begun to circle the clearing instead of passing through it, probing angles, searching for weakness. Ash noticed sooner. The German Shepherd had refused to settle near the stove that evening, pacing instead along the interior wall closest to the unfinished passage. His movements were slow but deliberate, nails clicking softly against the floorboards. The fur along his back stood just enough to catch the firelight. His ears flicked constantly, tracking sounds beyond human range, frequencies buried beneath the roar of gathering weather. Caleb sat at the table, checking the generator log by lantern light. The handwriting was his now, steady and controlled, layered over Elias's notes like a second voice answering the first. Fuel levels were acceptable. Load was balanced. Everything, on paper, should have held. The wind struck the house with sudden force, rattling the window frames hard enough to make the glass sing. Ash stopped pacing and turned sharply toward the door, body rigid, eyes bright with urgency. Then the lights flickered, once, twice, and went out. The silence that followed was immediate and wrong. The hum of the generator vanished, replaced by the howl of wind tearing through the trees and the low, unsettled creak of the unfinished passage outside. Caleb stood at once, heart rate spiking into controlled readiness. He grabbed his jacket, pulling it on without breaking stride, boots already near his feet. Ash was at the door before him. "Easy," Caleb said, not because the dog was panicking, but because the worry steadied him too. He opened the door and was met with a wall of sound. Snow drove sideways across the clearing, thick and blinding, carried by gusts strong enough to shove him back a step. The world beyond the threshold had narrowed to a corridor of motion and noise, depth erased, distance meaningless. The generator building was barely visible through the white churn. Caleb hesitated. In another life, hesitation had been weakness. Here, it was calculation. He looked at the passage, its skeletal frame now roofed, but still open along the sides. Boards overlapping just enough to break the wind without sealing it in. Snow slid along the angled roof instead of piling, sheets of it shedding away in heavy sighs. Ash stepped forward into the passage without waiting. His body lowered, shoulders rolling into a working posture, tail steady. He did not look back. He assumed Caleb would follow. Caleb did. The difference was immediate. The wind did not disappear, but it lost its violence. Inside the passage, sound compressed into a constant, muffled pressure instead of sharp assault. Snow struck the outer slats and fell away. The floor beneath Caleb's boots was dry enough to trust. The structure swayed, not dangerously, not rigidly. It flexed, exactly as Elias had intended. Halfway across, the passage shuddered under a powerful gust, the boards groaning in protest. Caleb felt the vibration travel up through his legs, into his spine. Instinct screamed at him to brace, to fight the movement, to dominate the space. Ash did the opposite. The dog adjusted his stance, lowering his center of gravity, allowing the motion to pass through him rather than against him. He moved forward in short, precise steps, guiding by example rather than command. Caleb matched him. The generator shed loomed ahead, its outline barely discernible through the storm. As they reached it, a violent gust tore through the clearing, ripping loose snow into a spiraling wall. A branch cracked somewhere overhead, the sound sharp and final. Inside the shed, the generator sat dark and silent. Caleb moved fast, lantern swinging as he checked connections with numb fingers. The problem revealed itself quickly. A fuel line choked by ice, pressure built beyond tolerance. He worked with controlled urgency, hands steady despite the cold biting through his gloves. Behind him, Ash stood at the open doorway, body angled to shield the interior from the worst of the wind. His fur was rimmed with frost now, breath steaming in short bursts, eyes fixed on the storm with unwavering focus. The rehook came as the generator coughed to life. The machine sputtered once, then roared, vibrations filling the small space. Light flared as the system re-engaged, power racing back toward the house. At that exact moment, the wind shifted violently. The passage groaned under the sudden change in pressure, one of the support posts buckling just enough to make the structure lean. Snow surged against the slats, clogging gaps, threatening to trap weight where it didn't belong. Caleb's stomach dropped. If the passage failed now, if it collapsed under load, they would be trapped on the wrong side of the storm. Ash did something unexpected. Instead of retreating, he moved forward into the narrowing space, stopping at the precise point where the structure flexed most. He planted himself there, body pressed against the inner railing, weight braced in alignment with the strain. Caleb understood instantly. The dog was counterbalancing. Caleb rushed forward, adding his weight beside Ash, shoulder against timber, muscles burning as they held the line together. The passage creaked, shuddered, then settled as the gust passed, snow shedding from the roof in a heavy cascade. The storm did not stop, but it no longer felt infinite. They moved back through the passage together, step by measured step, the wind raging on either side of them, contained not by strength, but by design. When they reached the house, Caleb slammed the door shut and leaned against it, breath ragged, adrenaline coursing. Ash shook himself once, sending ice crystals scattering across the floor, then stood calmly, tail low, ears still alert. Caleb slid down until he was sitting on the floor, back against the wall. He pressed his hands to his face, feeling the ache in his shoulders, the deep tremor in his muscles. He laughed once, short, sharp, almost disbelieving. "That was it," he said aloud to no one. "That was the test." Ash approached and stood over him, placing one heavy paw against Caleb's thigh. The contact was grounding, solid. Caleb looked up into the dog's eyes and felt the truth settle with absolute clarity. Without Ash, without the instincts that read danger before it arrived, without the body that knew when to yield instead of resist, he would have died here long before the storm ever came. Not from lack of strength, not from lack of skill, from lack of listening. Outside, the wind continued its assault through the night. Snow piled high against the buildings, burying the ground beneath white drifts that reshaped the land into something unfamiliar. Inside, the light stayed on, the generator held, the passage held, and so did the man who had finally learned what the place demanded. Tom tat no ai dung, Tiếng Việt. Chapter 6, là cao trào sinh tồn của câu chuyện. Một cơn bão dữ dội nhất trong nhiều thập kỷ ập đến, sớm hơn dự báo, khiến máy phát điện ngưng hoạt động giữa đêm. Caleb buộc phải băng qua hành lang mới xây trong gió tuyết khủng khiếp để sửa chữa. Ash đi trước, dẫn đường bằng bản năng, và chính hành lang, di sản chưa hoàn chỉnh của Elias, đã chứng minh giá trị. Khi công trình rưng lạc dữ dội, Ash và Caleb cùng giữ vững nó, vượt qua thử thách của mùa đông. Caleb nhận ra rằng nếu không có Ash, anh đã không thể sống sót từ mùa đông đầu tiên. Spring arrived without ceremony. There was no single morning when the snow vanished and the land declared itself renewed. Instead, the cold loosened its grip in increments, retreating a little more each day, as if reluctant to surrender ground it had held for so long. Drifts softened before they disappeared. Ice withdrew from shaded corners last, clinging to shadow like a habit that did not know how to end. The creek swelled with meltwater, its sound growing louder, less sharp, as if the land itself had begun to speak again. Caleb noticed the change, not with relief, but with attention. He had learned over the winter that survival here depended less on optimism than on observation. He stepped into the passage one morning and paused, surprised by the sensation beneath his boots. The wood was dry. Not frozen, not brittle. The structure held the night's cold without amplifying it, and the air inside carried a trace of dampness that no longer threatened to turn to ice. He stood there longer than necessary, listening to the forest wake in layers. Birds returning cautiously, wind no longer cutting but wandering. Ash emerged behind him, slower now, joints stiff after nights on hard floors. At 6 or 7 years old, the German shepherd's age had begun to show in subtle ways. A hesitation before rising, a deeper sigh when settling down. His coat remained thick and glossy, black and tan catching the morning light. But there was a gravity to his movements that had not been there before. He leaned briefly against Caleb's leg, not for support, but for contact, then moved to his usual position at the head of the passage. Caleb watched him, chest tightening with a feeling he did not yet name. The work of spring began with paperwork. Caleb drove into town once the roads cleared enough to be trusted, the truck moving more easily now that winter's weight had lifted. The county office looked smaller than it had months earlier, its brick facade softened by sunlight. Inside, the same quiet efficiency prevailed. Margaret Ellis greeted him with a nod, glasses low on her nose, her posture as upright as ever, despite the years etched into her hands. "You decided to claim it," she said, more observation than question. "Yes," Caleb replied. The process was slow but straightforward. Deeds examined, records verified, dates traced back through decades of ownership. The land had been forgotten by most, but not neglected by the system. When Caleb signed the final document, the pen felt heavier than it should have, the ink marking more than possession. Ownership, he realized, was not relief. It was responsibility made permanent. On the drive back, he stopped at the hardware store. Sarah Bennett stood behind the counter again, her auburn hair looser now that winter had passed, freckles more visible under the brighter light. She looked up as he entered, recognition warming her reserved smile. "Looks like you survived," she said. "Looks like it," Caleb answered. She rang up his supplies. Lumber, fasteners, sealant? Then hesitated. "People noticed the smoke during the storms," she said quietly. "Not many stayed up there this winter." Caleb nodded. He did not offer explanation. He had learned that sharing survival stories too easily stripped them of meaning. The repairs that followed were quieter than the construction had been. The roof was checked board by board. Seals reinforced where Elias's notes suggested they might weaken over time. The stove was cleaned thoroughly, ash removed, flue inspected. Caleb treated maintenance with the seriousness of someone who understood that neglect was simply failure delayed. Ash accompanied him through it all, moving less but watching more. He no longer patrolled the perimeter with the same intensity. Instead, he chose vantage points, thresholds, corners, the head of the passage, where his presence mattered more than his speed. The rehook came one evening, unexpectedly. Caleb was carrying a stack of boards through the passage when Ash stopped short, blocking his path. The dog's ears were not alert. His posture was not tense. He simply stood there, unmoving, eyes fixed on Caleb's face rather than the world beyond. Caleb frowned. "What is it?" Ash did not move. For a moment, Caleb felt the familiar urge to step around him, to continue on schedule, to override delay with discipline. Then he noticed the dog's breathing, slower than usual, uneven. He set the boards down and knelt, running a hand along Ash's shoulder. The muscles beneath the fur trembled slightly. "You're tired," Caleb said, the realization landing harder than he expected. Ash leaned into the touch, just a fraction, then eased himself down onto the wooden floor of the passage. He lay there quietly, eyes half-lidded, the wind brushing through the slats around him without consequence. Caleb sat beside him, back against the railing, and stayed longer than the task required. From that day on, the work adjusted itself around Ash rather than the other way around. By late spring, visitors began to arrive. Not many, just enough. A man named Jonah Reed, broad-shouldered and sunburned, with a beard gone white at the edges, and a cautious manner shaped by years of losing livestock to storms he had underestimated, stopped by one afternoon. He walked the passage slowly, boots heavy on the boards, fingers trailing along the railing as if reading it through touch. "Smart build," he said. "Doesn't fight the wind." Caleb nodded. "It doesn't have to." Others followed in time. A woman who lived several miles east, her face sharp with concern more than age, asked about fuel storage. A younger couple, new to the region and already overwhelmed by its demands, listened more than they spoke. Caleb did not present himself as an expert. He shared what he knew. He admitted what he had learned the hard way. The passage spoke for itself. Ash watched these interactions from a distance, rarely approaching strangers now, content to observe from his place. His role had shifted, not diminished. As summer settled fully, the land changed character. The forest grew dense and green, scars left by winter obscured beneath new growth. Caleb cleared ground for a small garden near the house, building raised beds from leftover lumber. The work was lighter now, less urgent, but no less intentional. He found himself thinking ahead in ways he never had before, not to the next storm, but to the next season. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air softened, Caleb sat alone in the passage and reread Elias's notebooks. He no longer skimmed them. He read them as conversation, noticing where the handwriting tightened, where calculations grew more cautious. Elias had built with awareness of failure, not optimism. That awareness had been his strength. Ash joined him quietly, lowering himself onto the floor with a soft huff. Caleb rested his hand against the dog's side, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his palm. He thought of the years he had spent running from roots, from names, from places that asked him to stay. He understood now that Elias had never meant this land as an escape. It had been an answer, waiting for the right question. When autumn approached again, Caleb felt no panic. He checked supplies, reviewed notes, adjusted where needed. The passage remained unchanged. It did not require improvement. It had been designed correctly from the beginning. On the anniversary of his arrival, Caleb stood at the edge of the clearing and looked back at the structures, the house, the workshop, the passage connecting them. None of it was impressive by conventional standards. There were no grand views, no architectural flourishes, and yet it represented something he had not possessed in years: continuity. Ash lay at the head of the passage as he did every night, even now, when the wind was gentle and the ground forgiving. His muzzle had begun to gray. His movements were slower, but his presence remained absolute. Caleb knelt beside him, resting a hand on the familiar fur, and understood the truth that had been forming since the first storm. He had not come here to disappear. He had come here to remain. A man who once measured life in terms of survival had learned to measure it in seasons instead. A dog who once followed commands had become the line between danger and home. And together, they stayed. Sometimes, what we call survival is not strength at all, but grace. Caleb believed he stayed alive because he was trained, disciplined, prepared. But if he is honest, the truth is quieter and deeper than that. He survived because, again and again, something unseen went ahead of him. A warning before danger, a pause before disaster, a presence that knew when to stand firm and when to yield. Some people call that instinct. Some call it coincidence. And some of us believe it is God working through the smallest, humblest messengers. A dog that sensed what a man could not. A path that appeared only after loss. A shelter built not just of wood, but of wisdom passed down through faith, patience, and love. In everyday life, miracles rarely look like light from the sky. More often, they look like protection we only notice after the danger has passed. A delay that saves us, a companion who stays. A quiet voice that tells us not to rush, not to give up, not to walk away. If this story reminded you of a moment when God carried you through something you could not have survived alone, hold on to that memory. Share it. Let someone else know they are not abandoned in their storm. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment about where you are watching from or what this story meant to you. And subscribe to Silent Paws Steady Hearts for more stories about quiet strength, faithful companions, and the unseen ways we are guided home. May God watch over you, protect you, and place the right companions in your life at the moments you need them most. May you be kept safe in your journeys, strong in your trials, and never alone in the silence. Thank you for being here.